In this module, we're going to talk about Chapter 4 in our Sheltered Content Instruction textbook. This chapter deals with writing language objectives and adjusting classroom speech to support English language learners. The Common Core emphasizes academic language proficiency as part of college and career readiness. The Academic Language Register is not familiar to many students. So when we talk about a language register, we're talking about a variance in the language. Many students are familiar with social language registers, but not academic language registers. As we've learned in previous modules, no one's a native academic language speaker. We all need to learn these skills. So many ELL students would benefit from academic language instruction that involves modeling, practice, and feedback. Academic language is more than just vocabulary, however. It includes morphology, in other words, how words are formed, grammar, sort of the rules of the road when it comes to language, and phonology, the sounds of speech. Language and content area instruction. Each content area has its own language, academic language, that must be taught. So this means that all teachers in some ways are language teachers. The language used for each domain should be taught alongside the content, so they should work together to achieve your content area goals. So here are some examples. Theory in science has a more specific meaning than we would use it in everyday language. I may have a theory about why Susan's always late, but it's not a scientific theory necessarily. Word problems in math need to be phrased in very specific ways so as to avoid ambiguity. And we would use a lot different writing styles for a personal blog as opposed to an academic journal review or, academic writing in general. And students need to be taught the differences. Okay, and language objectives should be developed alongside content area objectives. So there's basically 4 categories of language objectives. The academic vocabulary, so that's fairly self-explanatory. They're the content specific terms that are necessary for the lesson. Language skills and functions, that's how we use the language. Language structures or grammar. For example, the passive voice might be especially tricky for many ELL students. And finally, language learning strategies. So these are some of the strategies we've learned in other classes like self-monitoring, rereading or pre-reading. So your language objective might be to have students include specific words from a word bank you've provided them. Or you could explicitly instruct them to use rereading as a strategy to achieve your content area goals. Developing language objectives. Okay, so language objectives should be tailored to the academic needs of your students. So obviously you need to take them into account when you're writing these. And they should be presented both verbally and in writing so your students can refer back to the written part. Language objectives can come from sources such as English language development standards, like we've been learning about in WIDA. Language objectives should be presented and practiced in a systematic way. So we don't want to just kind of like be throwing darts at a dartboard with this. We want to have an overall long-term plan. Here's an example. A content objective would be students will analyze the historical events which led to the Civil War. So a compatible language objective will be students will use past tense when referring to historical events. Developing oral language proficiency in the classroom. So we want to give ELL students plenty of opportunities to use academic language. Oral proficiency and reading achievement are related. So the better oral proficiency skills a student has, the more likely they are to have good reading skills. And it kind of snowballs, they build on each other. And the more language rich the environment a student is in, the more rapidly they're going to develop these skills. Okay, language and sheltered instruction. Teachers should adjust their own speech to enhance the development of language proficiency for ELL students. So when you're speaking to your class, you need to take your students into consideration with your own speech. So you might control your syntax, meaning different lengths, using shorter sentences that are less confusing depending on the level of your ELL students. You want to speak naturally, but not really, really fast. You should avoid idioms or explain them. So there's a lot of things in English that aren't going to be obvious to a non-native speaker, like it's raining cats and dogs. I mean, what does that mean? Unless you explain it, they may not know. May you make use of high frequency vocabulary. So you may want to repeat the same words that you know they're going to understand in order to get your point across. Avoid pronouns when necessary. So it could be confusing if you're talking about Jimmy and Jack and you're referring to both of them as he. So which one are you talking about? So try to use their names to make it clear. Emphasize keywords, phrases, or concepts. Use direct questions rather than kind of indirect questions. And each instruction, when you're giving students instructions, should really just relay one idea or action. And they should follow a sequence and be written. So students, if they can't remember everything you said, they have something to refer to. And it's good to use repetition, restatements, redundant grammatical structures, so you're getting your point across in multiple vehicles. Now, here are some things to avoid when you're talking about sheltered instruction discourse. Too much teacher talk. So you're doing all the talking and students are just sitting there. Teacher cuts students off or answers his or her own questions. So I think we've all done this or seen people do this. It's easy to do when you're trying to get to the point, but you want to give students that little bit of extra time to come up with their own answer, and not providing them with a chance to have elaborate responses. So you're just giving them lots of yes and no questions. So this is what's kind of called a passive learning environment, where students are just sitting there and you're doing all the talking, all the work. This doesn't really give ELL students the opportunity to produce complex language. Another method that can help students with oral language development are what are called instructional conversations. Now, these are great for smaller groups of students. It might be a little unwieldy if you've got 30 kids and you're trying to facilitate this conversation. But in an instructional conversation, the teacher acts as the facilitator. The teacher isn't doing all the talking, but more just guiding students into more complex discussions. And here are some of the main elements of instructional conversation. The discussion focuses around a theme that resonates throughout the lesson. So you want to tie everything back to a theme. Teachers tap into students' background knowledge. So you're encouraging them to share what they know and not dismissing it because it seems irrelevant to you. Teachers provide explicit instructions as needed. So you're making it really clear what you're looking for. Teachers encourage students to use more complex language, so give them a little extra time to develop a more complex thought. Students are expected to provide evidence or elaboration for their answers. That goes back to the complex language. You don't just be satisfied with a yes or no, maybe prompt for what else can you tell me about this? How do you know that? How do you support that? And there's fewer known answer questions where you know the answer you're looking for and it's an immediate yes or no dismissal of right or wrong. The discussion's flexible, so you need to allow for student contributions. And connected talk, so each interaction builds on the previous one. And you would expect all students to participate. It can't just be one or two. Okay, so in summary, language objectives are developed with content objectives to enhance ELL language development. Classroom language should be modified to support ELLs in their listening abilities and understanding. Students should be given ample opportunities to develop complex speech rather than just be passive recipients of teacher talk. Okay, so that's it for this portion.